thank you everyone for joining. I will start with a brief note about the project, what the project is about that hosts this webinar today. So Project HEIDI, which is the short name for Digital Actions and Higher Education Institutions as a Catalyst for Social Change in the COVID-19 crisis, is a 2 years Erasmus Plus project which aims to upskill higher education staff and students towards more resilience, adaptation to change, and agility that could enable higher education institutions to work together with citizens to shape better societies. HEIDI aspires to reposition higher education institutions with respect to society and enable them to become co-creators in solutions to problems that surface in crisis situations. In HEIDI, we focus on 3 forms of digital actions. These are activities that focus on the maker culture, our makeathons, citizen science, and hacktivism, or more simply, hackathon activities. Today's webinar, which will be video recorded and later will be available on live via our YouTube channel, focuses on digital action ethics. Together with our panel members, we will explore, amongst others, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in designing and implementing successful digital action activities. I'm very excited to introduce you the fantastic panel of experts who will be sharing their opinions and views on digital actions today. These are Dr. Loretta Todiniene from Hanken School of Economics in Finland. Loretta is a social scientist experienced in interdisciplinary research with an expertise in research ethics, integrity, and social responsibility. Peter van Bohemen from Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, where his work focuses on artificial intelligence and ethics on a very broad range of topics from healthcare, finance, IT, and media. Then we have Professor Federico Federici, who is a professor on intercultural crisis communication in translation studies at UCL. We have with us Professor Huma Shah, who specializes in artificial intelligence at the Research Center for Computational Research and Mathematical Modeling at Coventry University. Marcos Moreu, a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at UCL in the Extreme Citizen Science Research Group. Professor Mookie Hackley from the Department of Geography at University College London. Mookie is the director of the Extreme Citizen Science Research Group with many years of experience in citizen science. And Professor Monica Lackampole, who is a professor of integrated community child health at the Department of Population Policy and Practice at the UCL Institute of Child Health. So I would like to first invite Loretta, our ethicist, who will give us an introductory talk around ethics in digital action. Thank you, Loretta. If you can share your screen.
So, hello to everyone, and I'm really, first of all, I'd like to thank Artemis for inviting me to share some thoughts, very few thoughts, what is happening in the field when we come up with digital action, either in regular research or, let's say, in citizen science, as we think about this linkage of science and society. I would start with a very short observation, what I noticed in the literature, and when we have to look for the balance, specifically when we should remind about the scientific aims that are very important for each professional scientist to follow and also to accomplish them when the research is conducted. But also there are some social and ethical responsibilities that each of us as scientists bear with our engagement in the research. And definitely having all this in citizen science, we have another element to which we have to pay much more attention is volunteer communities. So departing from this uh, search for balance, I'd like to continue with perspectives that we can discuss, or let's say we could question what would happen if we found ourselves in the digital age. So definitely digital technologies can facilitate our life. Would it be citizen science or traditional research conduct? However, we should also understand that with this new coming thing, we have to rethink and reconsider how we perform each stage in the research. So definitely that can transform or modify data collection, data analysis, engagement activities, and definitely all the red that comes up with the knowledge generation. So what I want to emphasize here that definitely uh, digital age can speed up many processes. However, it doesn't mean that we can do that in a more ethical way. And this is what actually digital age requests from us to come back and to revisit how we understand, how we frame research ethics and research integrity in any step. So when we look at this digital age, I would say we should look as how it could serve for citizen science and how it transforms citizen science itself. So we are in a very large digital environment, and definitely that is affected by many other aspects that uh, could be included or could be considered as part of the digital environment. So I mentioned very few components here. I would say the core ones is digital tools, digital services, digital data, and we have this kind of orange bubble standards. So are we aware, are we well aware of the fact how we should consider each step when we use something that relates to digital? So to consider these aspects, it's important definitely to be highly ethically sensitive. And we cannot detach what is ethical from what is legal or illegal. And when we discuss, which mean scientists, how we should follow or how we should reflect on ethical considerations related to our research, um, we all admit, or let's say almost all of us could admit that all research is subject to compliance with legal regulation. And it can happen so that the research, the specific research is legal, however, it's not ethically sound. And specifically when we can compare geographically different practices, let's say what in Asia might be legal, but in Europe it might be even illegal and definitely not ethical. So we should consider this kind of diversity, how the research could be affected when it is done with collaborative efforts. Another point is to speak about ethical considerations is to think about ethical frameworks. Should we keep going on using the same and stick to them as they are dogma, kind of dogma, or should we reconsider these ethical frameworks and start from realizing that other different ethical frameworks could be used as well? And the one that I would probably would be a proponent of relational ethical framework that relates to ethics of care, and to my consideration that it fits better to deal with some specific ethical challenges in the digital age. So definitely volunteers are invited to contribute, to discuss what is ethical according to their opinion, according to their considerations, and researchers should be responsive in integrating their understanding of ethical decision making. So these both should be very combined and not be only predominantly coming from researchers themselves. When we come back to, again, ethical considerations, we should also realize that there could be some dilemmas related to performing responsible research. So I will mention here only very few points. And definitely there are much more, and some of them I'm not able to share. That's because it relates to the study I conduct together with my international colleagues. But let's say the few points that already come from the published papers. So the one that is discussed again in this dilemma, how the researcher should do if he has an interest to retain volunteers to contribute in the long run, so to not to lose their contribution. But again, the researcher should also comply with diversity and inclusion. So to avoid any discriminatory character in the research, when the claim is that everyone is invited. So when I speak up on behalf of volunteers. So there are some risks definitely related how to include minors and other vulnerable groups. And there is specifically sensitivity, sensitivity relates to providing some demographics data, for example, if let's say age for minors, and that relates also to personal data protection. So again, this kind of looking for the balance, what to prioritize, or let's say what to devote for the sake of the research, for the sake of new knowledge generation. Another dilemma that also emerged, this relates to volunteers' privacy, and again requests to be accountable and transparent in the research. So again here we would be asked to acknowledge volunteers' contribution, and such practice exists already. We can find some papers that find a way how to acknowledge volunteers' contributions. On the other hand, there is also request in the research to ensure anonymity of volunteers, if specifically if they prefer to contribute anonymously, and how to deal with this kind of aspect when their contribution is substantial and they worth of all authorship. Another is that derives from this dilemma, I would say, and it's not yet discussed in the literature, is again how to ensure open science, how to implement this concept in practice when we speak about opening data and indicating who is the owner of the data. Another, say, dilemma of responsible research is about the use of artificial intelligence for the feedback provision. Again, that depends whether we want to minimize our
Loretta,
administrative.
sorry for interrupting, but you have to wrap up in a minute if possible.
Yeah, this is what I'm close to. So we have to provide feedback, and again to maintain this relationship with our volunteers so they could contribute in the long run. But on the other hand, we could also look for tools that facilitate feedback provision, and that's definitely harnessing artificial intelligence. But what my point is, definitely is to use human-like control in artificial intelligence if we decide to use it. There's another issue that relates to processing data and security data. They are coming for identification. There are different things that come up from practice, and we're already discussing the literature. And researchers should rethink what kind of other validation use could be used in the research in different stages, including data collection, data analysis. Definitely, we should consider what kind of platforms we use for data collection, either GDPR friendly. Can we use raw data as they are, or maybe we should apply anonymous or anonymized or pseudonymized data. So my last slide relates to ethical review. Again, this is kind of practice that is different country by country, but it's very important when we discuss collaborative research that is carried out in a few countries. And therefore the preference is to give to the policy regulation, which is the strongest in a port institution. Therefore, the institutional support is very important. So training, consulting, and I would say mention the ethical stress that is discussed more in biomedical terms, but again, that I think is very relevant for any field of sciences. So this is it. I say that the guidelines, very last sentence, Artemis.
Thank you very much, Loretta. I will invite to the panel members now to introduce briefly their digital action projects, and we can start with Muki.
Yeah, so the project that we've been involved in during the pandemic was a project with a lot of research across the world in different locations. And of course, the moment things happen, we had to call first of all, there is the ethics of working with researchers and bringing them back home. And then to reconsider how we continue in carrying out the research in an ethical way. And Marcus can probably mention a thing or two about his example in this area. But to kind of pivot into new ways of working was important.
Yes, Marcus, if you want to continue as you work in a similar context with Muki to describe your project.
Yeah, should we describe the project a bit, or we just jump in?
Yes, the project, please.
Yes, describe that specific bit of the project.
One of the things we do in some of the country, I'm going to focus more on sub-Saharan Africa, where I've been working on, is so we co-design geospatial and information and communication technologies for supporting rural communities, farmers, pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, fishers, in mapping their land, and also in some cases, especially farming context, to receive information as well, to have access to information on how to address these issues. And in terms of, so the process can be summarized in 3 stages. So engagement and co-design, mapping, and then sharing information. And there's ethical issues all through. And starting from the engagement, it's you already mentioned it. So who gets engaged and who's not, for instance. In the mapping stage is also who gets to decide what's mapped and what's left out of the map, and how it's mapped as well. And then especially the sharing, what happened with the data, who has access to the data, and what are the risks of open data, and also the benefits of it. And even if we decide, or the community decides to keep the data private, there's also risk to be taken into account. So yeah, and during the pandemic, yeah, we had some issues. I would say that most of the issues were in terms of logistics, because once we get there, COVID was not actually an issue in all the.
Marcus, we will discuss about the pandemic issues in a bit.
Yeah.
So if you finish with the project description, I would like to ask now Monica.
Hi.
Hi, Monica.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting to this interesting discussion. I'm going to talk about citizen science in the broadest context, because I know we have people thinking about it in different ways. And we were really looking at a project in the UK, which was working with families in temporary accommodation and those experiencing homelessness. And so an underserved community who were obviously affected by the lockdown quite a lot, because they weren't able to move around, weren't able to engage with other families. And we know in the UK that there's around 600,000 children who are at risk of temporary accommodation or live in temporary accommodation at the current time. And this is going up because of the cost of living crisis and because of poverty. So the project was really thinking through what the impact of COVID was at that time of living in temporary accommodation. And we had 3 pillars of work. One was around evidence-based gathering, and that was really the formal, quantitative, qualitative type of traditional type of research that we would do, using photographs as a way of engaging with communities and opening a dialogue where there might be stigma attached to the narrative or the discussion that you're having. And then a platform where we created a knowledge exchange platform, which was to try and encourage communities to send in their pictures, to send in their poems, to send in their stories, without that traditional model of us asking questions. So it was much more open to them. And then the third arm was really around advocacy, and the advocacy and translation into policy arm. And that was, again, engaging with photographs, pictures, drawings, poems, any creative arts approach, where the families could really have a voice themselves and direct the voice and direct the power in this conversation, and then utilizing that to translate that into policy and policy workshop. So in a nutshell, that's what we've been doing over the few years. But obviously COVID came in, went out, and we can discuss how that then changed things along the pathway. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Huma.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you, Artemis and Alice, for allowing me to participate today. It's really helpful. And thank you also to Loretta, who pointed out that, about inclusivity and diversity, which for us in my project, which I will quickly come on to, is not a tick box exercise. It's, as Monica said, it's giving voice to people, democratizing science and giving voice to people, so that more people are involved, and specifically around the topic that we're talking about, which is ethics and responsible research. And that is in the DNA of the EU-funded project that I direct the science on, led by Coventry University International Project 10 Partners, csicop.eu, which is about raising awareness about the extent of online tracking in websites and apps, specifically from the lack of transparency and informed consent about the tracking technologies, such as cookies, fingerprinting, and other technologies. So the EU project that I'm working on, what we've done is we've created a free informal education course, which is available in 12 languages. It can be completed in a learner's own time, and it's in 5 short steps. What is privacy? What is personal data? How are we being tracked online? Do we have any rights against all this surveillance online? And the free tools that help us to manage our data, particularly where there are parents who are concerned about the tracking of their children from educational websites and apps. So I can tell people more later on how COVID affected us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huma. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much for this invitation and this interesting panel. I'll introduce a more practical example that I've worked on during the pandemic in the early days. And if that's okay, I'll just show it to you, but that maybe it's the best way to share it. So basically, I worked on a project for making a personal protective equipment. So you can see it in the middle here. It's based on the snorkel mask. You know, probably remember in the early days of the pandemic, we didn't really know anything about the virus except for that it was dangerous and probably infectious through the air. So, and there was a big shortage for personal equipment. So I got a picture from a friend who worked in a hospital, from colleagues that were wearing these things. He said, "Hey, can you make one for me?" So of course I made one. So this was the first prototype, printed it in my own 3D printer. And then I found out also that there are lots of people around the world doing the same thing. And I joined an international group. Let's see over here. It was from the Stanford Prakash Lab. And in this project, I think from 24 countries, people collaborated on developing this type of equipment, testing it, validating it, and also distributing it around the world. We worked together in a Google Doc. Basically, all the designs were there, all the issues were reported, and in a Slack group. I also had my own Google Doc for the Dutch situation with all kinds of logs, and worked together with people, even coming up with our own design language on how to create these devices. Everything was shared on Thingiverse, and tens of thousands of these were used all around the world. For example, in the Czech Republic, they were distributed. And well, of course, we encountered many ethical issues in this process, and I will be happy to elaborate on that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. And Federico.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a fantastic conversation. My project started in November 2020, and it was actually initiated because of the pandemic. In my research between 2017 and 2020, I designed with colleagues a set of training materials to allow people who are speakers of 2 languages to understand the fundamental principles of translating languages. And in Sierra Leone, there was an urgent need to have people to communicate effectively healthcare information. Sierra Leone had suffered incredibly badly of the effect of miscommunication during the Ebola outbreak in 2014. So for them, it was a seriously pressing issue to have the information, the mitigating measures distributed correctly to the public. So I was contacted by YMCA Sierra Leone, who had been involved in the healthcare campaign in 2014, and they essentially didn't want to make the same mistakes that had been made in the past. So our project was initially an application of research that we'd done before and was supposed to be about training. Then when we started trying to train translators, we realized that there's no bilingual corpora, there's no way of tracking any digital or non-digital resources for the languages involved, Limba, Mende, Krio, Kono, Temne. And there was no way of creating such resources to support us using, for instance, machine translation tools or even simply computer-aided translation tools such as translation memories. So we suddenly realized that we needed to have a sort of quick backup project on identifying resources to create the support for translators and interpreters. So not just trying to train translators, but actually creating the resources for them. And there was a plethora of ethical issues, none of which required direct ethical approval because the project was of a different nature, but there were serious ethical issues involving our participants who were in most cases volunteers, but in some cases they had been volunteered, and that was quite problematic in the setup. I think I'm in within my 3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Federico, and thank you everyone for describing your very exciting project. I guess everyone would agree that people undoubtedly become more skeptical and critical about digital technologies, especially these days that digital technologies are entering previously inaccessible areas such as human rights with artificial intelligence, as Loretta described, and so on. Although digital activism as an umbrella term that includes the types of digital action projects that we look at HEIDI and we investigate in HEIDI, such as citizen science, hackathon, and makeathons, do aim usually to empower grassroots communities and generally provide solutions which benefit our societies. These do not come, unfortunately, without their critiques for potential risks. And that is because amongst the hundreds or even thousands of successful digital action examples, we can still identify some immoral yet legal practices, either intentionally or unintentionally, due to poor understanding of the ethical implications of these projects. And hopefully, if we have some time at the end, Alice can share with us such an example from a project which was a very popular project in the UK, was collecting COVID symptoms data across the country. So I would like to know your perspective on digital action ethics from the angle of the digital action work that you are mostly aware of, that you're involved in. What ethical tensions exist there, and what principles do you think that should guide our future work around citizen science, hackathons, or makeathons based on the project that you work on? Muki, do you want to start with you?
So I'll start with one thing. Something that happened within the research team was to kind of come up with the idea of remote researchers, which is also was something that I really liked, because it also helped in equity and distribution of research funds. So what it means is that instead of researchers going from the global north into remote places and carrying out research, identifying people locally that can actually be involved in the research and carry it out. And it's done, the reason that it's not done more is because of way that research structures and funding work and lead to certain solutions, but the pandemic actually opened up the opportunity and the agreement of the funder to do that. So I think that, it creates all kind of ethical issue about who you recruit and how you do that, and adding people to the chain. And of course, there was concern also within the UCL ethics about how to implement it properly, of all sorts of other reasons. So that to say that it's not a simple, easy solution, but it's got some interesting advantages and important potential for future research.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Muki. Marcus, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add on what Muki said about ensuring the sustainability of the projects, of the export experiments, is another ethical issue that we face in a couple of them is in ICT for development projects, it's kind of agreed that using existing infrastructure kind of increases the chances of project to succeed. And when these infrastructures are very popular platforms that are centralized, be it WhatsApp, Telegram, different, there is always this ethical dilemma of using these technologies as sharing platforms mechanisms, because that increases the chances, as I said, of the project to remain over time. But it's also strengthening the power of these platforms at the same time, because you're increasing the user base or you're strengthening the users that are already there. So yeah, this is another ethical issue related to ensuring that the projects continue over time after we leave and the local partners stay.
Great point, Marcus. Thank you. Huma.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, protecting the personal data of citizen scientists taking part in a citizen science project about data protection was a thing, because as you rightly pointed out, there are legal acceptances on extracting data from websites and apps. but they're unethical. So to protect the data of the citizen scientists, we had to make them aware, look, you are participating in our project to collect the number of tracking technologies in the normal websites you visit and apps you use, whether it's Bloomberg or a book review website. But please be careful, because even if you reject cookies, there are tools, legal tools called legitimate interest, which advertising companies use embedded underneath websites, where you will see scrolls and scrolls of companies who are claiming legitimate interest to collect your data such as your IP address, which site you came from to come to a website, what pages on a website you've looked at, all sorts of information. And they use that legal loophole within the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, legitimate interest. So, you know, we had to make people aware that not only are we doing a project on general data protection compliance, investigating it, we ourselves are implementing our own data protection for our citizen scientists to make them aware, look, there are these other tools. And we've seen that more and more people are becoming concerned about the amount of tracking online.
I was not aware of that, Huma. Very interesting. Thank you. I mean, the legitimate interest. So just for those who just joined, we are discussing the panel members' perspective on digital action ethics in general, and the ethical tensions that exist in the area that each of our experts is working on. So, Monica.
Yes, thank you. I think when it comes to ethics, there's sort of ethics on both sides, isn't there? We set up ethics panels to make things very stringent, to ensure we do things well. That also does have an impact on actually not being inclusive and not enabling us to engage, and putting barriers up that really are contrary to what we're trying to achieve. So a couple of things that we found in our project, and we can probably elaborate on later, so I'll just touch quickly on them. So one was the fact that during the ethics process, the forms that needed to be filled in, the tick boxes that needed to be were being asked was so many boxes, so many lines on the consent form, even just for pictures. So it's like you wanted to have photographs and families to send in photographs, and the number of different boxes. Are you going to use it for this? Are you not going to use it for that? Are you going to do this? And then we're working with people who are in COVID, are online, are using their own data. That's another thing, cost to them, they're using their data. And even if we're trying to pay for some of that, they're still utilizing, the families have one phone within a whole family. So you ask them to do lots of boxes and lots of patient information or community information sheets. It takes time, basically. And we sometimes make it more onerous for them through our ethics processes than actually helping them. And I think that's a really fine balance. So I think a lot of the discussion today will be about protecting through ethics, but protecting through ethics is also about making it easier for people to engage as well, not just the other way around. Translation into multiple languages that people can't even read because they don't actually read that. Their language is not in the verbal language. They actually hear the language, they don't read it. So you're creating so much information that's so daunting to them that actually, to me, that's also unethical. So that's just one brief point that we can pick up on. The other was really people sending in their photographs and want to be part of a project which raises awareness about homelessness, but are also very sensitive about the fact that will they be identified through it, just because you're taking they're taking pictures of the interior of their homes, and also, will this stigmatize them even more? Will it be that outsiders are looking in? So how can they share information to raise awareness and advocacy without actually triggering off secondary consequences from what they're doing? That needed to be thought about very, very carefully. And then the third quick point is really, what do we give back to people? And I'm sure all of us think about that a lot, is that your funding is there for 2 years or 18 months, particularly in COVID, very quick, very short projects. Everybody was involved in communities to gain information for them, even if it's through citizen science, and then the funding stops. So the funding streams don't have continuation of funding to say, actually, you've done this initial project, but we'll give you another 3 years to follow up and work. You've worked so hard to create this community with yourselves. and we will continue funding to continue with the community. So the funding stops, that community is suddenly left in the lurch. And then where do they sit with this? I mean, I think that's actually ethically unfair. And I have this conversation with funders quite a lot. And what we tried to do was work with the families. So last week we took the families to the football club. We showed them their pictures. We showed them what we had done. We showed them it hadn't just gone into nowhere's land and into a journal, getting a nice impact factor. But they were able to take back from the project the feeling of, yes, they have contributed and they can see what they contributed to it. And a thank you to all the children. So we keep that engagement, but it's very hard when you actually, the funding stops. So yeah, just a few key points was to think about that.
Fantastic points. And I think especially about your last point, like we do have to be more proactive and think about the communities that we work with throughout the whole project and give back to them as much as possible throughout the duration of the whole project, not just the beginning or the end. So who is next? Peter.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think one issue that has been mentioned already, of course, is dealing with vulnerable groups. And well, at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was vulnerable because, of course, there was not enough personal equipment around. And this leads to, I think, many ethical dilemmas, because when we were working on this personal equipment, at the beginning, of course, you put disclaimers there, like this has not been proven to be effective yet. But many people are already willing to try because they have nothing else. Well, then you're dealing with the ethics of whether you want to publish something that has been proven to be effective. But then on the other hand, to be able to conduct open research, open science, and to collaborate with people, you do have to publish it somehow. So there was a big, I think, a tension there. And of course, we ran into trouble because at some point we were able to prove that some claims that were made earlier were not true, or things were not working as much as other people have said. So I think this is maybe some kind of I would call it emergency situation ethics or emergency response ethics. Like, what do you do? Things do change a little bit in that context. Looking back, it's much easier to judge, but also with regards to personal data, by the way, because we also used all these platforms just basically because they worked and they had a big reach. But of course, we realized Google Docs and Slack are not the most friendly platforms out there.
I'm not very involved in the maker culture kind of like community, but I'm pretty sure this is a common issue that people are facing there. That's very interesting, Peter. Thanks for sharing with us. And Federico.
I think that there's 2 points, one that Marcos pointed out and one that Monica made, which were very important for our project as well. The first one is bandwidth poverty. So a lot of the funding of our project actually went to make sure that when our online training was delivered to different locations in Sierra Leone, there was electricity available, and there was a connection available, and there was a satellite connection available where possible. And together with that, there is the participation on the ground. Our collaborators were the ones who organized the setup. So they had to deal with the logistics. They were the ones who were traveling around Sierra Leone during the pandemic restrictions. And although the level of danger was a lot lower than, say, for instance, the UK at the time, still it felt very uncomfortable for us that we were delivering in relatively safe condition, and they were supporting the project directly on the field. And the other side of that is in particular a couple of languages where languages are predominantly used orally. So as soon as we started trying to collate information to create bilingual resources, they said, well, there's no point for us to write them down. We'll send you audio files through WhatsApp, because that worked very well during the Ebola. And of course, I know there is encryption from sender to receivers, but still not sure where it really leaves us in terms of protecting their data. And they were happy for us to have their voices, to have plenty of their voices, hours of their voices, so that they could contribute to the bilingual materials. So who is going to monitor, retain, and control that data over time? If it's lost, we're losing one of the outputs of the project. But if it's shared widely, we are sharing somebody else's voice. So of course we haven't done that, but are we missing something important? Because Limba continues to be a predominantly spoken language. So if we transcribe it, are we transcribing it for whom?
Thank you so much, Federico. Obviously, we have such a fantastic collection of different projects that they do have so many interesting ethical dilemmas to discuss in the next 40 minutes. But I would like to start with some more like methodological questions. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in some unprecedented changes across the societies. Some of them are still obvious. Conducting research during such difficult times resulted in increased practical and ethical challenges because we had to very quickly generate evidence, which, however, were balanced with the realities of the situation. So I would like to, first of all, ask Muki and Marcos, can you explain how the COVID-19 influenced your digital action research project in terms of especially working with human participants?
Let's do it the other way around this time. So Marcos.
Okay. Yeah, you can talk about the local assistance, but I wasn't involved in that. As I said before, COVID in the project that I was involved was mostly a logistical challenge. We had to delay, for instance, Ethiopia and the Nigerian project had to start at the time of, I think it was January 2020, which was the highest, the peak of COVID cases in the UK, if I'm not wrong, the worst time in the UK in terms of COVID. So we had to delay the project, the fieldwork actually 3 months. One of the reasons because coming from the UK to a country where there were no COVID cases were very low was ethically problematic as well. And then in terms of logistics, everything was shut down, testing, quarantines. But once there, the reality was that in major urban centers like in Lagos, yeah, you could see more on the street. But in the rural areas, it wasn't an issue actually. People were not wearing masks, except few exceptions. So we just follow what our local partners did. I mean, if they were saying it's all right, we can go to this place, even remote areas where it's even more problematic. Because in an urban area, if there's
what geographic areas do you refer to, Marcos?
What geographic areas?
What places? Yeah, I mean, like in which countries? What exactly?
Southwest Nigeria, rural areas in Southwest Nigeria, farming context. Yeah, and same applies for Ethiopia, which was 6 months after that, which was even a more remote area, very far away from Addis Ababa. And again, COVID was not, Corona, actually, because Corona was not really an issue there. So it did not impact too much except from the delay on getting there, but once there, there was a major consequence. There were consequences for them because in some areas where not in Nigeria and Ethiopia, but in Kenya, for instance, that do depend on tourism, the communities that we work with, that have impacts on them because travels there were no tourists, so there were no revenues for the community that depended on tourism. But in these other two places, no, that was
Thank you, Marcos. Muki, do you want to add?
Yes, it's kind of some aspects of that were noticeable is the complexity of the rules, both for the researchers in the UK. So, for example, the delay that Marcus just mentioned about traveling. But also once you're trying to set up, it limits. So there is one community that actually a researcher within the group interacted for a period of over 10 years, which because of the remoteness and the risk to the community from bringing in COVID, it was just we not continuing and hardly having any communication with that group. Whereas with other groups, it kind of worked through establishing remote researchers and building up and identifying it, but then going through the complex process of getting that approved. Also it's an interesting aspect of the COVID and of the remote working when you have a highly interdisciplinary project and you are forced to work only remotely. All kind of interaction that could have been sorted out face-to-face are forced to be done online, and are by their nature less efficient and taking more time. So the process of research preparation and coming out took more time.
Thank you, Muki. I would like to ask the same question about the complexities in working with human participants during the pandemic to Monica as well.
Thank you. Yes, so our work, as I've mentioned, it was with families living in temporary accommodation. So this is families who were in shelters, families who were in hotels, asylum seekers, in bed and breakfast. So already in a very, very difficult environment to access. And normally what you would do is you would first spend a lot of time building relationships. So we as the research team would spend a lot of time embedding ourselves in the environment, understanding, sensitizing ourselves to the environment, and understanding some of the sensitivities as well that we may encounter, and becoming culturally sensitive as well as environmentally sensitive. And then we would normally build our relationships with our third sector organizations as well. So that building relationships is core to then communicating and building partnerships with the families themselves to get, it's all about trust. If they trust you and they understand what you're doing, then they'll participate. If they don't trust you, they won't. So that normally is like, the heavy lifting really of what we do. Of course, with COVID, we couldn't do that. We couldn't enter into their space. It is their space, and we couldn't navigate their space in a normal way. So you're suddenly putting layer upon layer of barriers. You're communicating through third-party organizations. So we were having to communicate through third sector organizations and leaders. We were having to communicate through digital technology, which again is not the norm. And thirdly, everybody doesn't have the data, as we've just said, or a private space to talk to you. So women in shelters, it's a very, very sensitive situation. So you're already excluding people by the time you get to try and do any of your work at all. So we were very lucky in the way that what was interesting was it meant that I had to do a lot of the heavy lifting, whereas normally my research fellows would do it. So I would train my research fellows, we would have our workshops, we would educate them, they would then work with the community and build up bottom up the work we were doing. We couldn't do that because the research fellows are all at home, they're all online, they're not experts in this. So literally it was me heavy lifting because I had the expertise to do this and try and engage in a way that others couldn't do. So with the speed of the project, the speed of us having to utilize experienced members of the team, we had to step up very quickly to do that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have actually ended up doing it. And that gave that relationship building, because that trust was indirectly there. They knew who I was. They knew as a doctor. They knew I was a researcher. They knew as a professor. So some of those barriers quickly moved away, which otherwise wouldn't have moved away. So I think that those are really the thing. The building, the experience couldn't develop in the same ways that we'd normally develop. It had to be us who were already experienced. Relationship building was tough. And also we had community panels. We have our community engagement panels who advise us throughout the projects. We still found ways around that using digital access, but there's nowhere near that. It's the same when you just talk to people individually and you go and have a cup of coffee with them, and it's that indirect conversation that you have a walk and talk with them and you pick things up. Whereas here you've got this barrier of a screen, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Some people found that quite nerve-wracking, actually, to speak in that more formal context. So for us, that's probably, we were very pleased with what we achieved, but it was much harder than it would have been normally.
Thank you very much, Monica. I share very similar experiences from a project that I was working on with young people, trying to understand how they perceive youth violence and knife crime in East London. Very, very similar experiences. Huma, can I also ask the same question to you as well? What were the implications, the challenges in working with human participants during COVID?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So for us, it was like wanting to get this information about, do you know how much you are being tracked online? And our project started in January 2020, and the first UK lockdown came into for 23rd of March 2020, and our international partners around the similar time, they went into lockdown. But the first year, we were conducting a literature review on how to do citizen science. So that was good. We were learning how to do citizen science, but at the same time, we were preparing the free short course, Your Right to Privacy Online. So we were doing literature review on that, and also because I teach artificial intelligence ethics. And we really wanted to get the information out there about, hey, for example, if you're a female and you use a menstruation app, whether you have a Facebook account or not, as soon as you open the menstruation app, all the data goes to Facebook, whether you have a Facebook account or not. And there was so much knowledge like that that we wanted to get out there at the same time. But because because of COVID, once the research on how to do citizen science had been completed, and then we had a framework to engage citizen scientists, the impact of COVID was that the restrictions and lockdowns continued into 2021. So all this knowledge about, oh, hey, how much are we being tracked online? We had to then start doing online webinars rather than face-to-face. We had all these, we had this money, you know, for venues such as libraries, cafes, etc., to go to where people are rather than overwhelming people and say, come to university. So we had all this lovely money to go to places and invite people to webinars and face-to-face, but we had to hold them online, you know, and it wasn't the same. And what we found was that you might get many people registering online, but they wouldn't attend. And then we would follow them up afterwards and saying, you know, asking, so thank you very much for showing your interest. May we ask why you weren't able to attend? And would you like to do this course in your own time as a MOOC, you know, massive online open course, which can be done in actual half a day. And lots of people said, you know, they didn't have time and they were looking after, they'd registered because they were interested in the topic, but they were looking after elderly, or they were looking after, you know, children, home teaching. And we found that females had less time during COVID for extra learning, you know, this kind of informal learning than males. And yeah, so they couldn't participate in as much. And so that the COVID restrictions continuing into across 2021 really restricted our face-to-face engagement. And then the other thing was, because what we were asking people to do was to use their online time to investigate the websites they visit, the apps they use, the apps their children might have on phones, what tracking is in there. Once people did do our course, it really put them off. They didn't want to know about they were really scared. They said, oh my, we don't want to know. So that also reduced, because we weren't asking people during COVID to go out in nature and investigate nature or space science or plastic pollution. We were asking people to do things that they were doing anyway, which is working online, you know. So COVID really restricted us in many ways. Yeah.
You were adding to the stress, Huma, of COVID. That's very interesting. Thank you. So I would like now to go to Peter and Federico. Your digital action projects were set up as an immediate response to the pandemic. Several codes of ethics emphasize the ethical principle of social responsibility. For example, I was looking at the British Psychological Society's Code of Conduct, which suggests that, and I quote that, during the pandemic, only research that is of high social value should be conducted. The temptation to brand all research as COVID-19 relevant to gain accelerated ethics review and institutional approval must be resisted. So I'm wondering how easy it was for you to set up your projects or to participate in them. And did you have to brand your project as a COVID-19 project in order to get accelerated ethical review? And if so, was that a straightforward process? Did you get any institutional support? Federico, I'll start with you.
So if you don't mind me sharing my screen, that would help me answer your question more directly. So when we started, the status quo for Sierra Leone was not again. And the World Health Organization, after assessing their risk communication strategies during the Ebola epidemic, realized that there was a lot of mistrust around communication from the institutions. And a lot of that was also due to using the wrong languages, or when the right language was used, using the wrong format to the wrong channel, and not supporting the local population. So much so that in 2017, the World Health Organization reviewed its own communication practices, and the new guidelines are based essentially on what didn't go well in Sierra Leone and in the Western African region. And one of the things that was specified was that better information in other languages should appear. So this partially answers you why we didn't feel ethically challenged, we weren't exploiting in a way for research purposes what was happening. But at the same time, the project started with the view of applying existing research to, and it wasn't about data collecting at the beginning. Then over the last 2 years has evolved towards data collection, and then we had ethical approval, and there was around communicating risks multilingually, and it was ethical approval that we received for another project I was conducting also in Italy, where we were looking at vaccination hesitancy when you don't receive information in the right language or the right format. And because for the colleagues in Sierra Leone, it was important also to look at vaccination, it was important to look at prevention measures. What we could do was put forward an ethical approval for both projects, because what we were looking at essentially was how do you have to deal with multilingual communication of highly sensitive preventative measures. We took 1 month for the ethical approval. The reality, though, was that we were building on existing research that we conducted in this area, and that was an enormous advantage for us, because we had already been working on health-related multilingual communication. And for the partners in Sierra Leone, there was no sense that this was unethical, because the new project was bringing new data, language data, and their sponsors, being the United Nations Development Programme, felt that this data was advantageous. And we put in place data protection strategies according to the GDPR, and we feel that we shared what we could share. We brought back to the communities everything that we could, and our participants didn't feel exploited, with the exception of having to use their own data for submitting translations. And that we felt was our biggest issue. We weren't helping in any stage, at any stage, with the digital divide. We weren't providing any data support. And so a lot of the communication ended up being on WhatsApp, and there was individuals and volunteers WhatsApp time, WhatsApp money. And so all of the data that they spent was spent out of their own pockets. And that's something that we want to do differently.
And data are very expensive there. So interesting points. Thank you, Federico. Peter?
Yeah, I think
About your project?
I might have a bit of a unique case or a different perspective on this, because we were working on developing a product for a professional market. So the humans that were involved were professionals in a way, and the design well, the development of the product was done by mainly professionals in their spare time and also some volunteers, of course. I think the main issues that we had were, like I said, were around validating medical claims or product claims, and also distributing products without proper CE marking, for example, or going through independent approvals. And that, of course, led to discussions within the group, because and some people around the world were already producing and distributing parts, while others were still trying to prove whether they actually worked or not. So there was a big tension there. And also what was an ethical issue was that we noticed that many people joined the group because they saw it as an economic opportunity to finally get an entrance into the medical market. They were already running a company and trying to somehow access this market, and now they saw, hey, there's an emergency situation, and now I can make a profit out of that and actually get to know this market and establish connections that will also be beneficial beyond the pandemic. So that was also an interesting thing to witness, and it was difficult also to deal with that, because of course they were contributing to the initiative, but at the same time they had different motivations. So yeah.
You did mention, Peter, at some point that Harvard University was also involved in.
Oh, Stanford.
Sorry, yeah.
Yes. So
if they had to submit an ethical review, like application, or
I suppose they also published the work in scientific journals. So I guess, but I have to be honest, I can't remember that anybody ever mentioned it during the initiative itself. So it wasn't really,
Great, thank you so much, Peter. I will now move on to my next question. So, I guess from what we discussed so far, it kind of like started to become evident that as researchers, it is very important for us to consider the additional stress or the pressures that the individuals, as like human participants that we engage, may be experiencing or what they were experiencing during the pandemic. For example, we had to consider and be sensitive to the extent and nature of people's vulnerabilities, and especially those who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So I was wondering, and Huma, for example, mentioned that in several cases, a lot of the research had to be conducted instead of face-to-face, online, and changes had to happen literally overnight. So my question to start with Huma would be, did you have to submit an updated research plan to describe these changes, the risks and ethical implications for review again?
Ethics applications we've revised twice, but not the actual methodology, because luckily in the proposal and in the grant agreement, we had that we were going to create a MOOC as well as create learning for face-to-face. So because of COVID, we had to create the MOOC first. But because we knew we were going to use that MOOC as the delivery for online, we had to make it not a MOOC where, a MOOC can be a few weeks long. We had to make it into a short, about half a day informal education course, which could be completed in 5 short chunks of half an hour each. So that was the adaptation, to make it smaller.
Huma, did you get any institutional support in terms of like revising the ethical applications to accommodate the COVID-19 restrictions?
I did the ethical applications, and I'm used to doing them. So there was no real, we, like any university, we have an ethics application. And as Monica said, there are reams of pages in the online ethics application. And again, as Monica pointed out, the GDPR compliant participant information sheets, and the informed consent. And what we did was to show that we're fully compliant for the short course, the MOOC. What we did was prepare a MOOC specific informed consent sheet. So when people completed the short informal education course, there was a set of questions, test yourself, 10 multiple choice questions, which we were guided by UCL, University College London, because they maintain the EU Citizen Science platform. And we also translated the MOOC for that platform. So they guided us and they said, make sure that you have like a self-assessment, 10 simple multiple choice questions, and offer a certificate. So there's some kind of reward, and there's a way for people to establish what have they learned. So for people to claim their certificate, we utilized, and because we have a legal partner, Stellar, they are lawyers, to prepare an informed consent sheet just to claim the certificate, which meant that to anonymize data and to protect data, the person who completed the short course would give us informed consent to use their name on the certificate. So in other words, there was adaptation, but showing our learners and people who are participating that we are fully GDPR compliant, and this is how we are implementing. So we're not only just investigating GDPR compliance, we are implementing GDPR in a simple way. But of course, that means that's a lot of time needed from the volunteers, time which was precious in COVID, because, for example, we found that females had less time to volunteer because they were doing their own research or their own work at home, homeschooling their children, which because of a lot of school closures during lockdown, home cleaning because you couldn't have, cleaners coming in to clean the house. So there was less time to do volunteering of this type, which involved online. So I don't know if that was a bit confusing and answered your question. Sorry.
Thank you, Ma. Thank you. Monica, did you have to resubmit an application for ethical review for your project? And in that process, we're particularly interested what kind of institutional support UCL provided.
So for the Champions project, we didn't, because that was actually a COVID project. So everything was written in the ethics as though we were in COVID. And so we were covered basically for that. We didn't have to do anything at all for that. We had other projects, another citizen science type project where actually there was an issue in the way that actually it was the unlocking that had the issue, because we wrote the project for lockdown period and actually then going into areas. We decided not to do that actually so much for the other one, but here we wanted to go with the children and the young people and everything, and we wanted to utilize the space when we were unlocked, and that was going to prove to be extremely difficult to rewrite in time to be agile enough to then get all of the safety, health and safety and ethical issues adjusted for that. And actually it was a decision was made by, it was a consortium, a national consortium, that we weren't going to do that, because actually the length of time it would take and the complexity that was going to be taken to keep people safe and everything ethical was too much. So in short, and then we had another project where we did have to again make some ethical changes, which was an international project. But in short, the answer to your question is, did we have any support? No. We had there was a rapid assessment process, so that's fine, that was in place. There was a whole guidance sheet on what you had to do, which was there, but there was a lot to actually have to handle, and we were the ones who had to try and navigate that ourselves. But other people may, not that the ethics people weren't trying to help, I don't want to say that, they were obviously trying to be as helpful as possible, but ultimately it came down to the research team trying to navigate the documents online.
Thank you, Monica. And Muki, you. Did you have to reapply for ethical approval, and did you get any support during that process?
That's a question that you need to ask yourself.
But I cannot answer it because I'm asking the questions.
And as we know, it did, and it took a significant amount of time actually to rethink and readjust things. But that's the nature of this, and I kind of associate it with the whole complexity of dealing with that. And at one point, we did have the recognition from the ethics committee that the type of activity that we're talking about, which, as Marcus and I mentioned, is very much led by the participants is something that the ethics process is not well designed for. It's assuming that you do something to someone, not that you do something with someone. And if you design it in advance and kind of in the case of Monica with the experience of the field and other things, then it can work well. But in our case, it created complexity. And I do think that, for example, having a tea and conversation with the ethics people could have sorted out things that became more difficult to do remotely and in a detached way.
Marcos.
And by the way, Artemis, you can say that I'm wrong.
I will say now, because I was involved in applying for ethical approval for several projects. I know, like one, the very difficult aspect it was to kind of try to understand and include in the risk assessment unfamiliar to us national health guidance, like from geographic locations very far away and in languages that we could not even understand. So Marcos, do you want to say a few words about that? How easy was for you to identify and accommodate into your research plan any COVID-19 restrictions in these areas that your field work involved?
Yeah, came more from what Mukis just said for the participatory nature of the process. In terms of the ethics, we wrote the ethics, actually, the application in COVID, so we didn't have to modify anything in one of the case studies. The other one, we need to modify, but that was led by another organization, another UK university, which, yeah, we did have to modify it a bit, also to extend the validity of the ethic approval. But yeah, it wasn't a major one, at least in the projects I was involved in terms of COVID.
Thank you, Marcos. And I'm going to now go to the very last question, which is for everyone to answer. In your opinion, how easy would you say that it was for the wider research community within the broader digital action context to ensure research integrity in such an uncertain environment? And on that, I would like to also add, was there any specific that the pandemic has taught us about digital action ethics? And I will start with Loretta.
I think given all the experience that I heard, maybe I would end up with some kind of advice that comes from any research, either it's related to citizen science or not, that first of all, any changes in the research that have been already ethically approved should be again checked with the institutional review board. But that depends very on the practice. Either ethical review procedure should be run from the scratch again, because of even of the minor stage, let's say changing recruitment strategy, or maybe in some institutional practice there is kind of you only have to inform about the change, so to shorten this procedure. But definitely any change should be discussed with the institutional review board and should not be relied only on the decision of the researcher. So I think this is something that should be taken as a shared responsibility between institutional review board and researcher. Another point is about the data that was mentioned shortly, but something that also should be learned, that data should not be deleted or erased, but the decision should be taken what data should be open, what other data should be only stored. And that goes with potential kind of claim in the future, whether the data was generally collected. And just to prevent from any false claims let's say, including volunteers, whether there was kind of harm made in the research and so on. So these kind of very other, I would say, sensitive points that serve for the very long future of the research.
Thank you very much, Loretta. And I would like to ask the same question to Monica.
I think some of it I've covered already, but I think it's that balance between safe ethics and overburdening ethics. And I think that's something that COVID taught, not just for ethics, but for everything. You know, you can be more agile. You can sometimes make decisions that are sensible. And sometimes you can make the process quicker and more agile because we need to get on with the research. Not that it shouldn't be safe, and not that it shouldn't be academically rigorous either. And I think, like I've given examples about everything having to be in every language when it doesn't make sense for the project that you're doing. Again, sometimes I think what I've experienced is with ethics, sometimes individuals may not understand citizen science and community participation, a bit like Mookie said as well, is that they don't always understand. And in actual fact, say some of the questions I've had is, should you be asking this question? Or maybe they won't want to have this, or maybe they won't want this. And you're saying, well, the whole point is that people have a choice and people are being included, and this is an inclusive process and the power is with the people. But what you've just done is done everything contrary to what we're trying to achieve by saying they cannot do this, or it's too sensitive to them, or it's not fair to them. So I think the processes have to be rigorous, but there has to be some balance in what we do, and ensuring people who are on the ethics board understand citizen science, community participatory research, understand this sort of work is really, really important. Because I have had different experiences in different cities, and you know, in another city that I worked with previously, this was the norm for the work that we used to do in the community. It was very, very common. Real understanding of the speed as well with which you had to turn things around. And I'm in other areas, you know, we struggle with a much more biomedical model with people who don't tend to have such an experience in this sort of field. And yeah, so I would say we've learned a lot. My worry is that we will revert back to what we had previous to COVID and not take the learnings forward.
Great, thank you very much, Monica. Peter? Is there anything specific that the pandemic has taught us about digital action ethics?
Well, for me, what was very unique is that because, of course, this global urgency, that I really witnessed global collaboration, and that people from all over the world collaborated in one project in a very open way. But that also learned me that we don't have procedures or the ethical practices that work with that, because from dozens of different institutes, spontaneous collaborations emerged. I wouldn't know actually how to do that in a formal, correct way. So yeah, that would be my main takeaway.
I think that becomes the main takeaway from the whole discussion, that digital activism needs better ethics. But Federico, what is your message there about digital action ethics?
I would subscribe to everything that's been said so far. If we can stay ethical and protect and safeguard, but remaining agile, that would be a great learning from what we've done. The other side for us, though, was, and maybe that was just my ignorance, but the digital divide is real. So if you want to have digital action, we need to invest in reducing that divide. Otherwise, yes, it can be global, but it stays as it can be, not it's going to be global.
Thank you. And Mookie, I'm sure you want to add to that.
Yes, I completely agree about digital divide, and actually there are digital divides. There are multiple, and they have multiple aspects of it. I think that one of the biggest learn was that it's always the case in ethics that you need to take the context and the environment and the differences between the life of the researcher and the lives of the participants and their specific context. what the pandemic has done is actually to hyper that. All your assumptions about how someone else is and what's their condition and all the rest of it must be out of the window in such situation, and you must take into account. You see the extreme of it, like for example, for Marcos working in Ethiopia and having completely different condition because people are terribly relaxed about it and actually potential of doing things about other things compared to attempts of working with marginalized groups in London and getting into grips about the way that the pandemic influenced their life, their children's life, their ability to study, and the kind of things that Monica managed to do, while us in a different project failed to kind of get through the system to implement. So all this assumption, so you need to be very careful about your your assumptions of what life like for the people who participate in that. And that's kind of one problem within the conceptualization of ethics that need to be dealt both in pandemic, of course, in regular days, but especially in those kind of extreme situations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Muki. And I would like to close with Huma.
Well, I just would like to address the digital divide. I mean, what we found was within the digital divide. So, you know, you have to have access to opportunity to information, you know, about things. But there was a gender divide within the digital divide, and you know, information poverty for the socioeconomic status of some people. There was a gender divide. So we just need to be aware of that as well.